Has anybody ever just looked back to the past and just think, wow, things were better back then? Yeah, I love thinking about the past as well. Also, I'm cool because I'm wearing sunglasses inside. But whenever I think about the past, I love talking to people who are stuck in the past. They're like, Darian, if I never have gotten hurt, I definitely would have gone to the NFL. Bro, you were third string. If I had never done this, and we think back like, oh, if only I could go back. Things were so much better then. And yet what we're doing is we're looking at the past through rose-tinted sunglasses, thinking things are so much better. And it's funny is, I can't even read that. So memory, I love the quote. It says, memory is always infinitely better than reality. Isn't that true? We look back on the past and we think, man, it was so much better then. But realistically, we're not remembering what it actually was like, right? And so for some of us, we spend so much time wearing our rose-tinted sunglasses that we miss what's going on in front of us right now. And this morning, I want us to take a look at a group of people who were thinking things were better back in Egypt, when the reality was God wanted to give them the greatest gift they could ever imagine. So if you have your Bibles, turn with me over to Exodus chapter 14 and stay there. But we're going to start with in verse 1. But again, that's Exodus chapter 14, starting in verse 1. I broke them. So Exodus chapter 14, starting in verse 1, it says, Then the Lord said to Moses, Tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp near Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. They are to encamp by the sea directly opposite of Baal-Zephon. Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around the land in confusion. Hemmed in by the desert, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, but I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. So the Israelites did this, and when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, What have we done? We have let the Israelites go, and we have lost their services. So he had his chariots made ready and took his armies with him. He took 600 of the best chariots along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with the officers over all of them. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites who were marching out boldly. The Egyptians, all of Pharaoh's horses and chariots, horsemen and troops pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they encamped by the sea near Pi-hahiroth, opposite of Baal-Zephon. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us here to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. See, the Israelites have already left Egypt. The plagues have already happened. Pharaoh has already decided that he's going to let the people go, and God tells Moses, I've got a plan. Here's what we're going to do. You're going to encamp out right next to the sea so it looks like there's nowhere for you to go. And what I'm going to do then is I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart. And I'm going to harden his heart so much that he wants to pursue you. And that's the plan. But here's the beautiful thing. I'm going to make sure that you're all saved. And I'm doing this Because it's not to bring glory to you or the Israelites, but it's to bring glory to myself. Why? Because the people needed to know that God is almighty. And so he lays out this plan and he tells Moses this, and God hardens Pharaoh's heart, and Pharaoh all of a sudden is sitting there, and the officials go to tell Pharaoh, hey, they've left. And then Pharaoh had to stop and think, we've lost our entire workforce, basically. We're not going to be able to continue to pursue things the way we did. We are never going to be able to financially recover if we lose all of our workforce, all of the Israelites. And so what does he do? The Bible tells us he gathers all of 600 of his best chariots, but he brings his entire army. And what does he do? He starts to pursue them. And then he sees this poor group of people who are stuck in the middle of sea or beside the sea, and there's an army on the other side. And he probably is thinking to himself, this is going to be a cakewalk. And of course, the Israelites, they look up and they see next to them is the sea. And then on the other side, they see the Egyptian army. And fear starts to creep in. And it's not just like a small creep, it's like you're getting hit by a bunch of bricks creeping in. So fear is engulfing the Israelites, and they're looking over there and they're starting to cry out to God, but then they look to Moses and they say, hey, was there not enough graves in Egypt? You brought us all the way out here in the middle of the desert next to the water just to die. We were better off in Egypt. Things were so much better when we were slaves, because at least then we knew we weren't going to die by sword. We were going to die working to death. Things were better when we were slaves. At least we had roofs over our heads. Things were just so much better, and they have their rose-tinted sunglasses on, so to speak, thinking that Egypt and slavery, being beat by whips and things like that when they weren't working hard enough, was better than the freedom that God had promised them. Things were so much better back then. We had it all, or at least we thought we did. Because I think, it's truth, I think we often find ourselves in the same position as the Israelites, thinking being enslaved in Egypt is better than being free. Church, there are so many moments whenever we look back and we think, man, things were so much better then. I remember about 2 months into my job in youth ministry, I've told you I was not a big fan of youth ministry. And it's not that I didn't love the ministry part or the people. Here's what I hated the most: spreadsheets and keeping a budget. And you know what else I didn't like? Paper plates and napkins. I know that sounds weird. I'm a big picture kind of guy. And I remember just not liking how things are. I'm not good at keeping budgets. I'm not good at thinking about, hey, if I'm going to order pizza, they probably need to eat something on it. They need to have napkins and all these other things. That's just not my gift. And so I remember emailing my old boss, asking if I could get my job back as a resident director at Oklahoma Christian. And she said, you know, Darian, it's probably going to be hard for you to get your job back because you left in the middle of the semester. Number one, I am so grateful she said that. But I remember thinking back, things were so much better back then. And I was super stressed with the job and everything else because I was doing school and other things, and it was just so stressful. And I wasn't thinking about that. I was just thinking about, man, things were just better back then. I had it so good. And yet I decided to ignore all of the problems and things like that. And in truth, I think so many of us think to ourselves at times, if only we could return to a simpler time. Things were better before I was in this position. Things were better in this moment. Things were better whenever I was in that bad relationship or whatever it may be. Because I have talked to people who get out of horrible relationships. I mean, terrible. And then a month later, they want to go back. Things were better back then. Things were better when he was beating me. Things were better whenever this was happening. Things were better when when I thought I knew what my future was. Things were so much better than when they were lying and cheating to me and things like that. We get caught up in these rosy pictures and thinking, I can change them, or I can change this, or this was just so much better than what we had. And the truth is we forget the pain and the struggle and the problems. Guys, we cannot lie about the past. There are good things there, but there are also a lot of bad things. For so many people, you have been desiring and pushing to get to a certain point in your life. And when you finally get there, we think, man, things were so much better then. We forget the pain. We forget the struggles. And truthfully, church, we sometimes have to look at reality. We wear our rose-tinted sunglasses for so long, thinking about the past, that I think we forget and we completely miss what God is placing out in front of us. See, maybe things are not as great as we think they are, or we think they were. And maybe Moses is on to something when trying to encourage the Israelites. Now, Moses did make do a single problem. God told him to play from the playbook, but Moses may have forgotten to tell them what God was going to do. But anyway, but Moses was on to something whenever he was trying to encourage them to understand, to stand firm. And that's where we're going to pick back up in our text as we continue on in Exodus chapter 14, starting in verse 13. And Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see deliverance. The Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them. And I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all of his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. When I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots and his horsemen." Then the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them. So, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to one side and light to the other. So neither went near the other all night long. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued them, and all of Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During that last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots that they had difficulty driving, and the Egyptians said, Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen." Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak, the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing towards it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and the horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived, but the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and the Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of God displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. I love what Moses says. Do not be afraid. The Lord will fight for you. In other words, you don't have to do anything. The victory is already done. And what he says, the only thing you need to do is be still and God will move. Do not be afraid. The Lord will fight for you. Because in truth, you can't go back. There's no going back to where things were. So do not be afraid. The Lord will fight for you. And Moses is worried and also panicking. And I love what God's response is. He says, why are you crying out? What are you doing, Moses? You know the play. I've told you what the plan is. So the plan is you need to get these people moving, and I'm going to take care of the rest. You need to outstretch your hand, and you need to get moving. And so what happens is the plan goes in motion. The cloud moves to the back of the people, and God's victory is in motion. All Moses has to do is to take his staff and stretch out his hand over the sea, and the sea will begin to part. Where there used to be water, there is now dry sand, dry ground, and all of Israel will pass through the waters unscathed and unharmed. Because the Bible tells us that where there is darkness on one side and there was light, darkness on one side and light on the other, and that none would pass, none would go near it. And so that allowed Israel the time they needed to go through the water. And as they're going through, Pharaoh eventually begins to see what's happening. And the Israelites are getting onto the other side, and Pharaoh takes his chariots and his army, and he pursues the Israelites. And then whenever they start to notice the trap has been sprung, the army realized that the Lord is fighting for them. And what does Moses do? He puts his hand over the sea, and the waters collapse on Pharaoh's army of all the chariots and this entire army. And the people see the promise and the glory of God. You thought it was better in Egypt, and yet God said, I'm going to fight for you. They saw their enemies lying at their feet across the shore, and they realized then the power of God. And the Bible tells us that they learned to fear the Lord, and they learned to trust Moses. Now, I would love to say that after this moment, the Israelites never complained again. I would really love to say that, but that's not true. Eventually, they'd complain about not having enough to eat, and then they'd complain about meat, and they'd complain about water. Then they'd complain because Moses is up on a mountain too long. But in this moment, they learned for at least a split second to trust God and to trust Moses. And maybe, just maybe, for a second, at least a few chapters, they learned that maybe the power and the grace and the gift of God is way better than being slaves in Egypt. See, maybe what they were starting to learn is that the promise is worth the journey. Because what God promised them was a land that was flowing with milk and honey. And yes, their disobedience and their refusal to understand and believe in God throughout their journey led to it only being their children that received the promise. But at least they still received the promise. And so, what the Israelites realize is they cannot go back. And what that means is, like the Israelites, we cannot go back. You cannot go back in time. You cannot go back to when you thought things were better, or you cannot go back and change things, even if you wanted to. All we can do is move forward. And church, what we have to do is we have to start moving forward, and we have to stop looking back with our rose-tinted sunglasses and missing what God is wanting to get you to learn or do, and we have to move forward. See, we have to get back, we have to get out of this horrible habit. Because let's face it, the past is not really better than reality. Even though there are some good things that happen, the reality of the truth is that God was pushing you and moving you to get to where you are today. And if God is getting you where you are today, He's not going to leave you on the riverbed of the lake of Pi, and I'm not even going to try and pronounce it. He's not going to leave you there while the Egyptians are right there. God's already given you a path to get across the sea, but you've got to trust in Him and take a moment and say, I'm going to trust you, God, even though I don't like it, even though I'm worried right now, even though I'm scared right now, even though I'm stressed right now, I'm going to trust in you because you know what is best for me and my family and my future and where I need to be. You're not going to leave me here out to die. It's not a moment, was there not enough graves in Egypt? No. God is pushing you and moving you to where He needs you to be. And guys, we have to stop this wearing these tinted glasses and wishing we could go back, because I have seen so many people who have spent their entire lives thinking, if we could just go back and do this, or I could change this, or I could have done this better, or whatever it may be, they have completely missed what God has put in front of them. Have you ever met somebody like that? Where they're missing out on what God is doing for them or what God wants to do in their life. The people that God is placing there and helping them to try and get them to say, hey, stop worrying about this and let's get moving. Guys, we have to stop going through life like this. Let me know when I'm near the steps, though. I don't want to fall. Because do you realize what happens if we spend our life doing that? Number one, we're going to fall. I would have fallen down those stairs and hit my head, and then I'm suing. I'm just kidding. But guys, we cannot live life that way. The past is great. There are good things that happen, but the past is what made you who you are today. And we have to realize that we cannot go back, so we have to move forward. We have to take those things that we've learned and we have to grow, because it's in the future where the promise of God lies. The promise isn't in the past. The promise is in tomorrow and in the next day and in the next day. You may not like where you are. You may be like the Israelites wandering through the wilderness right now, but you will not stay in the wilderness. See, it's in the wilderness where we grow into the people that we have to be to take a hold and grasp the promise. But we have to keep moving forward and growing and allowing God to change us and shape us into the men and women that He needs us to be for tomorrow. So, church, we cannot go back. We can't go back. And we have to remember that. And so, for those of you who are wanting to go back, there's nothing but hurt and pain when we live a life that's looking into the past. We can only move to the future. And so, church, as we stand forward and we look towards tomorrow, when we think about the Las Cruces Church of Christ, we got to think about what can we do to help the church for tomorrow. When you look at your lives and you're thinking to yourself, things are so much better. No, look into the future and grasp whatever it is that God is asking you to grasp. So if you'll do me a favor before we end, look to your neighbor and tell him we can't go back. We can't go back. Look to your second choice, the one you didn't want to look at, and tell them it's okay. You can't go back either. Church, let's move forward and grasp the gift that God is wanting to bless us with. And let's move forward into tomorrow and into 2025 and 6 and 7 and then on and then on. And let's embrace the gift and the journey of God.